All right, guys, so we're going to take a look at the end of the unit questions all together. So what I did is I put together a bunch of questions that you're going to see on our unit test, which we'll probably do through quizzes. I'm going to suggest that you even have these questions out next to you while you're taking your test. Okay, it's going to have some little cheat sheets. Think of it as like taking your vocab cards in like we normally would. Okay. All right, so some things we got to remember about exponential functions. So that was the unit that we're finishing up, is exponential functions. So we know that the general equation is going to be a b to the x. So we have to remember that the number in the front, or our a value, was always our initial amount. Whatever in the situation, what it started with. The number inside the parentheses. Now, if that number is bigger than 1, that was what was considered our growth factor. Now, if that number that was inside the parentheses was between 0 and 1, so I guess I'll write it out in words. Between 0 and 1, then we know that it was our decay factor. And then this was our exponent, or our variable in our situation. Okay, so those are just the parts to the equation. Now, when we work with word problems, we're going to have something that looks like this. Now, just like before, the number in the front was always your initial amount. Okay. This was always your percent. And T always stood for the time. Okay. Now, just like before, this value here inside the parentheses, it happens to be the same exact thing as what the B value is. Just written a little differently. It's the same exact value. That's your factor. So let's jump into the problems. So in question 2, given the function, what is the initial amount and the growth factor of the function? So there's two things. We need to figure out initial amount, and we need to figure out the growth factor. So if I write above this, or actually I write below it, I use a different color. Y equals a b to the x, it's going to be pretty obvious. The a value is my initial amount. Well, what's the number in front of the parentheses? So my initial amount is 3,400. Now my growth factor. So up here, I see that my growth factor has to be the number inside the parentheses. Well, what's that number inside the parentheses? So my growth factor is 2.45. That's all you got to write for that question. Question 3. What type of function could be used to model the data shown in the accompanying graph? So if I take a look at my graph, it's definitely not a straight line. But remember, we always read a graph from left to right. So if I start on the left side and I look at my graph, it looks like it's going down. So remember, if I have a graph that goes down, this would be an exponential decay. Now, just as a reminder, if I have a graph that starts here and then goes up really, really fast, that's exponential growth. So in this multiple choice question, definitely not quadratic. Trigonometric, we don't even know what that is. Definitely not a straight line. So this is an exponential. All right, question 4. The equation is being used to calculate the amount of money in a savings account. What does 1.02 represent in this equation? Well, a b to the x. So 1.02. 1.02 happens to be bigger than 1. Think about it. $1.02 is definitely bigger than $1. I know that this is growth. So I'm going to erase my decay answers. So then we got to figure out what kind of growth, 0.02% or by 2%. So I don't know if you remember from the very, very, very first video that we went over how to find a percent. So to find the percent, you need to take that value and subtract 1 from it. So I think on our little cheat sheet it said b minus 1. So if I subtract 1 from it, I get 0.02. But because we're trying to find the percent, we got to multiply this by 100. If you multiply that by 100, you get 2%. So the answer would be option 4. All right, question 5. Given this function, looks an awful lot like what we did before. Which one represents value in dollars of a comic book 2 years after its purchase? The yearly rate of appreciation of a comic book is, well, if I look at each one of my answers, it's asking to find the percent. So if I take a look at that, look at the number inside. Is that growth or is that decay? Well, 0.9 is definitely not bigger than 1. 90 cents is not bigger than $1. So I know this is not growth. So to find the percent. So in this case, if I do this minus 1, I'm going to get a negative number. Can't have negative numbers. So let's do 1 minus 0.90, which gets us 0.10. Again, multiply that by 100 because you're trying to find the percent. And you get 10. So my answer would be 10% decay. All right, so Annie invested $2,000 in an account at a 3.5% interest rate, compounded annually. She made no deposits or withdrawals on the account. Part A, write a function to represent the situation. So because this is a word problem, we're going to be using our handy dandy little formula. So now the only thing you need to know is this growth or is this decay? Now because we're working with interest will always be growth. So that means we're only going to use the positive. So I'm going to have A equals, now what's my initial amount? 2,000, parentheses, 1 plus, now what's my percent? 3.5 over 100 raised to the t. Done. You wrote an equation. Part B, how much money will Annie have after 4 years? Well, 4 years, that's time. So I'm going to take my formula. Instead of a t, I'm actually going to replace the 4 as an exponent because we're talking about money. So now you need to use your calculator. So I have 2,000 1 plus, remember alpha y equals, don't forget that, 3.5 over, oops, $100. I'm going to raise that to the 4th power. So after 4 years, it looks like she's going to have $2,295. And is it 4 cents or is it 5 cents in my answer? That 6 is going to round that up to a 5. So it gets $2,295.05. Question 9. Kayla was given $5,000 when she was born. Her parents invested it at a 2% interest rate compounded annually. No deposits or withdrawals were made. Which expression can be used to determine how much money Kayla had in her account when she turned 21? Well, this one is 2 choices. Easy peasy. So the only difference is, if I look, is the plus and the minus. So is this a growth or a decay function situation? Well, again, we're talking about interest. Interest is always growth. So growth must mean we have to use the plus. So A would be our answer. Question 10. The current population in a town is 12,000 people. The population is decreasing, so that's really important, at a rate of 5% each year. Write a function to represent the population in the town after X years. Sounds an awful lot like this part right here. This type of question. Well, it looks like we just had to write an equation. All right, so because we're decreasing, I should be writing an equation that has the subtraction sign. So now I just need to fill it in. So A equals, so my initial amount looks like there was 12,000 people. 1 minus 5 is my percent, always over 100. Space there. Raise it to, and they're telling you right here what your variable is, X years. We wrote a function. Remember, function is just fancy word for an equation. All right, guys, last question. We're almost there. The breakdown of a sample of a chemical compound is represented by the function P of T equals 300 times 0.5 T, where P of T represents the number of milligrams of the substance and T represents the time in years. In the function, explain what 0.05 and 300 represents. So it wants to know what is this number and what is this number. Well, this looks an awful lot like y equals a b to the x. Well, what do we know about the 300? That's the number in front. So we know that 300 is the initial amount. All right, so what about 0.5? Well, if you go back, what did we say? The number inside parentheses, it's either going to be a growth factor or a growth decay, depending on the problem. Well, is 0.05 between 0 and 1, or is it bigger than 1? Like 0.5 is a half. So that's definitely decay factor. All right, any questions? Run through these questions. Make sure, again, I'm telling you guys to have this paper out with the answers. You can even have the video playing while you're taking your test. There's nothing wrong with that. Think of it as using your vocab cards. If any of these questions confuse you after you've gone over it yourself, reach out to Mr. Hart and I for a video conference. Hope you guys have a great weekend and see you on